Okay, folks, I think we're going to get started. If you're just visiting City Lights today, we're having a book release party for one of our own publications, so feel free to take a seat and join us. My name is Stacey Lewis. I'm the Vice President of City Lights Publishing, and I handle a lot of the publicity and marketing of the books that we publish. It's always special to have an event here at the bookstore where we're celebrating one of our own publications, the beautifully designed and beautifully written Beneath the Mountain, an anti-prison reader, edited by Mumia Abu-Jamal and Jennifer Black. Gorgeous cover by R. Black. Everything about this book is so special, and we're excited to welcome you all here. So again, the book contains essential radical texts by enslaved, jailed, and imprisoned Americans. It's edited by renowned political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal and activist scholar Jennifer Black, who has traveled miles and miles and miles to be with us, and we're grateful. Also grateful to Noelle Hanrahan, who's come back to the Bay Area. She is a lawyer and a private investigator and the director of Prison Radio, which is an organization that broadcasts the voices of prisoners and the incarcerated, now in its 30th year. She has been working with and advocating for Mumia Abu-Jamal since July of 1992. So I'd like to welcome Noelle Hanrahan to the mic.
Thank you. Really excited to be here. We're going to have readers, and we're also going to have Jennifer Black, who is the co-editor of the book with Mumia Abu-Jamal, introduce the book, and we'll have a short piece by Mumia. When you were coming in, we played a piece, Mumia reading Leonard Peltier's Message to the Water Defenders, which is also included in this book. And Leonard Peltier's case is very important right now in terms of Biden potentially pardoning him and giving him clemency. So that's a campaign that we want to forefront, that we want to hold up, because we have very little time to do that. And Leonard's been in for many decades. So I'd like to welcome Jennifer Black, African-American scholar and a professor at Penn State, and also worked very closely with Mumia to do this book.
Oh, thank you. You know, it's almost sad to do this without Mumia here, but you have me instead, and I convey everything to him, and I'll explain everything and how it went to him. And meanwhile, this is how we do it. When Sekou Odinga was released from prison in 2014, he went on a lecture circuit from city to city, community group to community group, university to university, which is where I encountered him at the Ohio State University. And he said, and this was a hard lesson to hear, but it's important. And if you don't know who Sekou Odinga is, it's all right, but don't feel badly about that, but know that that is part of the problem. He said that we basically forget about political prisoners, that every revolutionary vanguard movement around the world puts on the forefront of their agendas and platforms the uncompromising and unequivocal release of their political prisoners. But that we haven't done that in this country. Our current movements have all but forgotten yesterday's freedom fighters. We don't support them financially. We don't support them emotionally, politically. We don't support their families. We don't do significant education or outreach on their behalf. We don't put them on our activist agendas. Worst of all, we leave them to die in prison. And too frequently, our attempts to procure their freedom fall short. And as badly as political prisoners are overlooked, it's even more dire for our nation's social prisoners. The state of prisons and the phenomenon of mass incarceration is a temperature check, the miner's canary, the societal indicator, the social gauge with which to interpret the state of our nation and predict the direction we're going in. The presence of prisoners like Mumia Abu-Jamal promises that our social justice endeavors are vulnerable, because prisons are the linchpin to maintaining the social order. Mumia's incarceration means none of us are free, and I will quote him here. This is something he wrote in a question and answer exchange to a classroom of Ohio State students who were reading his first book, Live from Death Row, which was published in 1995. And they asked him, "What's the best way to advance your freedom campaign?" And he answered, "It's to pass the word among others, especially young people, that my freedom isn't separated from your own, because if my constitutional rights get stolen, yours get weakened and can be ignored at will." In that cue, if mine gets stolen, yours get weakened, he's prodding us to recognize that their fates, all of our fates, the fate of our society, are inextricably bound with his. Our fates are tied to what happens to prisoners and to what happens inside prisons. The future of our social justice aspirations is tethered to the future, to the prison predicament. And too often, the price of dissent is death, dismemberment, political repression, and incarceration. Mumia and the example of his life is that reminder that the prison system is a leveling force that acts to frighten, intimidate, and warn us, and to neutralize our movements. Beneath the Mountain is Mumia's 14th published book. He's recorded over 3,000 broadcast essays over the course of decades, available for listening on Prison Radio's website. Additionally, he lectures in numerous places, provides commentaries, book reviews, and interviews on request. And in his extra time, he achieved a BA, an MA, and is in the final stretches of his PhD. Dr. Abu-Jamal. He works constantly, and we know he's capable of incredible feats of brilliant public intellectualism, and what he has managed to accomplish from his cage is unmatched. He's part of a venerable tradition of incarcerated intellectuals, many of whom have contributed substantially to our collective bank of political knowledge and social justice knowledge. And the idea for Beneath the Mountain sprang from a desire to center and highlight the knowledge and wisdom of incarcerated people, because we know that the most structurally disempowered people on earth, those who have experienced firsthand the weight of living beneath the mountain, hold the keys to disrupting the function prisons play in our society. Every contributor in the book has been some combination of incarcerated, detained, or enslaved. And together, these voices teach us something. They teach us about organizing strategies, especially how to organize in dangerous places and dangerous times, about the role of political education and the centrality of political consciousness, about solidarity, and how to unite across the intersections of differences, and the importance of revolutionary hope to sustain us, and of revolutionary love. About the tricks and tactics of the state, political repression, and the role prisons play in maintaining the status quo. We hope that this book will be helpful to a wide variety of people, but we did have one demographic in mind, in particular, when we worked on the book, which is incarcerated learners, as well as other independent learners who might not have access to digital research information, university libraries, the mentorship of esteemed professors, advanced search engines, or any decent library. We decided to do this book after many years of conversations about history and about radical traditions, and we've been greatly inspired by the incarcerated radical tradition and by the political education that happens in prisons. We hope this book stands in the canon of that tradition as both a testament to it and an example of it. And it's our wish that all justice-loving people find something useful in Beneath the Mountain, and we aim to get it into the hands of as many incarcerated people as possible. But it is my most fervent wish that this book inspires more people to know Mumia, to learn about his story, and be galvanized by the tragedy of his wrongful conviction, his wrongful incarceration, to care about him and to act on his behalf, to understand the mutuality of his experience and ours, that if Mumia's rights get trampled, ours get weakened. We're here together, free, supposedly, 5 days after the state of Missouri executed Marcellus Williams. You know, how many more will there be? How many more will die? Not because they're literally executed, but because they've been sentenced to death by incarceration. sentenced to death with no chance of parole consideration. What chance will student encampment protesters now, return to campus have when the reality is we don't protect our visionaries, our righteous rebels, our fighters, our warriors, our heroes and sheroes? What kind of prognosis is this? Our lives and our futures and the future of our movements for justice depend on recognizing that we are inextricably bound to Mumia Abu-Jamal. His fate is our fate. The fate of prisoners is our fate, and the destiny of prisons is our destiny. Mumia survived 2 death warrants thanks to the movement, international in scope, that prevented it from happening. But he is now at age 70 in danger of death by incarceration. And the only cure for Mumia is freedom. So please, we're encouraging you to please do whatever you can to devote yourself and help build the movement for his release from prison. And you can start with a list of 10 things to do to free Mumia Abu-Jamal, but don't stop there. Do anything else you can think of. We can organize regionally and connect to national and international groups as well. And we can't fail in this mission. The only acceptable outcome is freedom. The only acceptable outcome is for Mumia Abu-Jamal to walk out of SCI Mahanoy upright on his own 2 feet with a giant smile and his fist pumping in victory. And we need this victory, and our time is limited, and we must not fail. And that's what I came to tell you today. And I'm now going to pass the microphone to our wonderful guest and reader, David Gilbert.
Thank you. Greetings, and I have to start by saying what an honor and what a pleasure to be at City Lights with this great history, and to be talking about a book by Mumia and Jennifer, and to be working with Prison Radio and the great work it's done for over 30 years. I'm going to read something from the book, which is a letter by Angela Davis that she wrote from jail in 1971. And in a minute, I'll explain why I'm going back that far. But the circumstances were Jonathan Jackson, at age 17, his heroic effort to get prisoners released. And he took hostages from the Marin County courthouse. And of course, the prison guards fired on the van that was leaving. And as a result, 4 people were killed. Angela wasn't there, but she was a leading advocate for prisoners. And they tried to bring her in and accuse her. And she was facing a life in prison, 1971. And she ended up being in Marin County Jail for 16 months until she won acquittal at a trial. It wasn't a given that she would. It was a great campaign and a great defense. The reason I wanted to highlight her is going way back to 71, she's very clear about a number of connections that we have to keep in mind. One is between prisons and the military, between US imperialism suppressing global South struggles throughout the world, and at that time, particularly Vietnam, and the prison industrial complex and what it does as a force of white supremacy and control within the United States. So that connection is a very strong one. At a time when people working around political prisoners and prison overall were somewhat in different spheres, she understood the two went together completely. She also, which was completely unusual for the prison movement at that time, brought a feminist lens to the struggle and emphasized and talked about women in prison, in jail. And she also early on, very early on, called for abolition of the prison system, which is a very radical concept then, and highlights how people can struggle under the most repressive conditions. But another reason is this incredible landmark letter and beautiful spirit in politics was never published before. It's another reason to call attention to the value of this book, Beneath the Mountain, because this letter was published there. Sisters and brothers, during the past year, scores of letters from men and women chained to America's military apparatus have been brought to my cell. Although I have attempted to answer as many as circumstances permit, I have not been able to reach all those people who have reached out to me. Those of you who have written should know that your messages of support and solidarity have provided me with an endless source of strength. Because of you and many other sisters and brothers, the almost total isolation which the jailers have imposed on me has hardly done its job of eroding and breaking my spirit. Over the past few years, movements against all forms of racism, economic misery, and war have found themselves a target of harsh, repressive measures. Government terror and intimidation have frightened some people away from the front lines of struggle. One would think that those struggles located in the most perilous regions of the government machine would be the first to collapse. But sisters and brothers whose commitment necessarily carries the greatest risks, who are surrounded by terror and intimidation, often have been most persistent in ensuring the continued life and vitality of our struggle. In America's military structure, and I'll just say it was a period of many GI rebellions against being used against the Vietnamese people. In America's military structure and in the dungeons of her penal system, enclaves of resistance continue to grow stronger. Wherever there is an American military base, wherever there is a prison, the will to fight oppression is fiercely asserting itself. In both places, there's aggressive and growing resistance to the war being waged against people of color and poor working people. Both the military and prison systems, together with the police and court structure, play critical roles in maintaining a political and economic balance that favors the wealthy who rule this country. They, the life nerve of American government oppressive power. In their own ways, both the prisons and the military touch almost every section of the people in this country who are not among the powerful. Black people, Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans, working people and the poor. As a consequence, both the military and the prisons reflect many of the ills which afflict American society as a whole. In recent years, the people in this country have learned a great deal from prisoners and from men and women in the military. The long concealed brutalities woven into the normal routine of prison life have been laid bare. People are beginning to talk not only about reforming the prison systems, but about abolishing them altogether. From those who have experienced it firsthand, and people who have learned the military's use to name and kill people in Indochina who are trying to seize control of their lives, who are trying to be free. And at the same time, that monstrous machine oppresses those whom it forces to fight its battles. Prisoners have realized this. Sisters and brothers in the military have realized this. Indeed, the great achievement of these two movements has been to expose the ugly face, not just on the prison and the military, but on the entire fabric of American society. And so, because sisters and brothers in these movements have sought and discovered creative and demonstrative ways of conveying new levels of understanding to the people of this country, the repression has grown more intense. George Jackson has been murdered. The Soledad brothers in San Quentin 6 are being assaulted under the guise of legal justice. The case against Billy Smith is an example of the kind of frame-up which attempts to intimidate others in the military who might be drawn into the struggle. Prisons are full of beautiful, committed, strong, struggling people. Their beauty, commitment, and strength are a threat to the rich, to racism, and to the wars which sacrifice human life for profit and power. Repression will not turn us around from our struggle. What we must begin to do now is create more effective lines of communication and more mutually supportive activities for those of us who are fighting it out in the prisons and those fighting it out in the military. We need to intensify our efforts to reach our sisters in the ghettos, the barrios, the factories, and on the unemployment lines, and brothers out there in the streets of this country, all of us joining together in a common struggle. This is a way we can put freedom on the agenda.
I'd actually like to bring David up again and just have a conversation with Saleem Holbrook. So Saleem Holbrook is in the book and is going to read from the book, but he's also the executive director of the Abolitionist Law Center and really ground zero, I think, for the transformative work that's being happening in the country and also for all of us who live in Pennsylvania is the movement that came from the inside out and which Saleem is leading. So the movement developed by prisoners inside and by their families outside, and now is transforming what we can imagine is possible. And I hope you mentioned some of the things that you're doing right now, Saleem. So Saleem, come on up. And also, if you both could say how many years you did and now that you're free.
Thank you, Noelle, that generous introduction. Well, David, I'm going to cede to the elder and let you
Well,
talk
in
about
terms
how
of
much you did.
years we each did, I did 40 years and 14 days. We're going to keep counting the days too. And Saleem, you did 27.
Yeah, I did 27. I went in at 16, so I was a juvenile when I came in. I mean, we both certainly went to prison for different type of circumstances. I was a young kid caught up in the drug and gang culture in Philadelphia, and was involved in a drug-related murder when I was 16 years old. And when I went to prison, I had the fortune to meet political prisoners in Pennsylvania, like Russell Malone Schultz, Fred Muhammad Burton, Joseph Jojo Bowens, and many others who inspired me to, make a transition. And David Gilbert was one of those political prisoners that I didn't physically meet, but in those years in solitary confinement in the hole, because that's where I met political prisoners, and David could talk to this is where the system buried them. I had the fortune to read about your story.
And I want to step aside and let Saleem read, but I just want to say I'm in awe of him and people like him who went in at 16 or at an early age. And prison does everything possible to dehumanize you and make you feel like you can't do anything constructive or positive. And for him to educate himself and then to be a crusader and a successful crusader in not only opposing the prison system, but taking legal and political and social measures to get a lot of people out. I think that's really impressive. And it gives us hope that despite all the viciousness of the system, that the human spirit can rise above them.
Definitely. And again, I got to give credit to the political prisoners who put me on that path. Thank you. Well, I certainly have a great memory, but I'm not going to be able to read from memory. So can someone please give me a book? Thank you, Jen. So one thing I want to talk about is that, I was one of those people in this book, like many in this book, that was sentenced to die in prison. I went in at 16. The state initially was attempting to kill me through the death sentence, but they failed to accomplish that. But they did sentence me to spend the rest of my life in prison. And I was only released as a result of the Miller versus Alabama case of 2012, where it said that children could not be sentenced to mandatory life without parole sentences. And that brought home over 500 prisoners in Pennsylvania who were children and were sentenced to spend the rest of their life um, in prison. So, not only can I, relate to many of the folks in this book, I was one of them, right? I was in the same prison as Mumia Abu-Jamal, SCI Green. And SCI Green was basically the state's torture chamber. It was a prison that cost, close to $200 million, and it was designed specifically to isolate prisoners. I was from Philadelphia. The prison was close to 200 miles away from my home. You were locked down 23-1. And for those of us that found ourselves in the control unit, that's another stage of the hole. So you got the hole, but then you have the hole within the hole. And that's where a lot of us were dumped, not for being troublesome prisoners, because I could tell you that my first couple of years in prison, I was caught up in the prison culture, was involved in fighting, stabbings, all type of crazy stuff. The most time I would serve in the hole for any of that was probably 30, maybe 60 days. It was only when we became politicized and started challenging our prison conditions through litigation, through advocacy, through organizing our families on the outside. I spent years in the hole, right? So that shows you what the prison sees as a threat, or what the system prioritizes. So I was one of these prisoners who was at the time looking to get out, who was fighting to get out. And so though I was fortunate to be free, one of the things about prison abolition is that I've seen is that a lot of time it's confined within academia. And for those of us who were sitting in those prison cells, in those cages, we were looking for a gap in the system to get us out. And so for me, it was the law, because they had me confined. They had me, like, I wasn't going to escape from SCI Green. I was in my cell 23-1. I was in a hole that was within a hole. So I had to look at the law to free me. And so I had to take it up, but I didn't believe in it, because I didn't believe in the law, a system that could sentence a 16-year-old to spend his rest of his life in prison because he was a lookout to a drug-related murder that he wasn't aware that was happening. But I wasn't unique, because you had 14-year-olds who were in that situation. You had 16-year-olds who were on death row in Pennsylvania. And then when I saw the way people were being left in solitary confinement for decades, being treated as disposable, because that's what the system does, I didn't believe in the law, but I also knew that I had to learn the law in order to free myself. So that is what inspired this this piece I'm ready to read from, called Dismantling the Master's House. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Audre Lorde. I was struck by Audre Lorde's quote a couple of days ago during a conversation around decarceration and abolition. I came to abolition by necessity, not by choice. When I was 16 years old, I was arrested and subsequently sentenced to life without parole. We call it a death by incarceration sentence. My options were limited, and at the time seemed confined to overturning my sentence on appeal or commutation by the governor. Both options in Pennsylvania had odds of around 1% at the time. I buried myself in the law library, teaching myself how to navigate court opinions, statutes, and rules of procedure. From behind razor wire and gun towers, I experienced firsthand the impact of the 1990 crime bill that birthed mass incarceration on steroids. I became frustrated at realizing how the state weaponized the law against Black and brown communities, especially Black and Latinx youth. Laws were never used to make our communities safer. It was during this time that I found law can be used as a conduit for resistance, and how oppressed peoples have historically used the law as a tool to aid in their liberation. This brings me to Audre Lorde's statement, and how, to sound blasphemous as an abolitionist, I don't completely agree with it. I came to this observation in the most unlikely places, the state's special management unit, a hole within the hole in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. This was a 23-hour-a-day lockdown where I remained for close to 3 years. In an environment designed to lay dormant the human soul was where the seeds of abolition were planted. It is there that I found the historical tracks on rebellion and abolition, like American Negro slave revolts, David Walker's Appeal, and the Black Jacobins. It is there I discovered the fighting history of the Maroons, who carved enclaves of freedom and abolitionist societies out of the slave regimes in Americas. It was there that I discovered the story of the Amnistad. It is where, to my delight, as a born native of Philadelphia that our city was a key station on the Abolitionist Underground Railroad and produced abolitionists like William Still and Octavius Cato. It was also there that I learned of the heroic anti-colonial struggles of the colonized and oppressed peoples around the world, particularly in Asia and Africa. I discovered how colonized people waged wars of national liberation on the battlefield of their homelands and within the halls of the United Nations and its International Human Rights Charter, a world body that was established by colonial powers. To read how African and Asian liberation movements used a body of law propagated by colonial powers to liberate themselves from colonial oppression resonated with me. What resonated more was how, despite using it, they did not for 1 minute believe in the body of laws created by the colonial powers. To them, it was just another tool in their war chest. It was in the abolitionist programs of the Black radical tradition that I found the master's tools, in fact, have been used to dismantle the master's house. Slave rebellions have always held a special place in the consciousness of Black political prisoners and politicized prisoners. George Jackson, Malcolm X, Assata Shakur, and Sophia Bakari all speak to the inspiration slave revolts had on their thinking and politics. But abolition in the cage is different from the envisioning of abolition out here in the new world, in the free world. It wasn't long ago that the seminal books I named above on slave revolts were banned by the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. Prison bureaucrats realized that the system they operated had too many similarities with the plantation system, and books on slave rebellions were banned as subversive and or disruptive to the orderly operation of the institution. Those words are seared in my memory today, even though I've been home for 3 years. As a prisoner agitator and abolitionist, I fought the censorship regime and prevailed by using the master's law to dismantle the DOC's mail policies that allowed this censorship. Other comrades and I viewed our campaign on prison censorship as a plantation rebellion. We filed grievance after grievance on every denial, had people on the outside challenge the censorship, and organized direct actions against it. As organizers and abolitionists, we weren't trying to make our imprisonment more comfortable. For us, it was a matter of survival and an ongoing strategy. Books on slave rebellions were political education for us, and the ability to hold political education multiplied our numbers in the prison system. When it comes to the law, the same applies. It can be used as an organizing strategy. We certainly didn't believe in the law, and all of us at one time or another during our imprisonment spent time in a hole for attempted escape or suspicion of escape. We didn't pin our hopes on the freedom in the law. Our motto was we'd either get out the white way or the right way. The white way being the law and the right way meaning going over or under the wall. For us, it was using the tools or weapons at our disposal to gain our freedom. And the inspiration for this, again, was found in the courage, audacity, and tools of our ancestors.
Need to stay for 1 second to talk about what's happening now on the ground and what he's leading. So Saleem, what's happening on the ground? What has changed in the last 10 years in Philadelphia, which I consider a very pivotal place, and Pennsylvania, pivotal place? It is the place where the super predator laws were originated, where much of the mass incarceration templates were rolled out, and where there's been a deep battle for people's families to change that.
Yeah, I think you summed it up, that you said a battle. You know, in the past, it was always a one-sided fight. It was basically the state were pretty much slaughtering us. Now the difference is the battlefield, the terrain is contested, and there's certainly not parity. I don't want to sit here and say that we're on parity with the state, right? But the difference is that over the course of 10 years, prisoners' families and prisoners on the inside have organized, and we organize in the prison cells, we organize on the prison yards, and a lot of this actually goes back further. It goes back to 2001 when a group of us was in solitary confinement in 2 of the states breaking prisons. I talked about SCI Green. Some of us were at SCI Huntington, and SCI Huntington was an antithesis of SCI Green, in that when I was at SCI Huntington in the hole, that was the old style break-in prison. That was a prison that looked like Shawshank Redemption. It was over 120, 30 years old. It was a very brutal regime where the guards physically sought to break you, whereas though Green, it was more of a mental fight. But in those holes, a group of us that knew each other, knew each other from the prison battles, from organizing in prison, really made a pivotal decision in that. You know, I tell people that I spent 27 years in prison, and I had comrades that we would go to bat for each other. You know, we would put it all on the line for each other. But I could be straight with you that some of them I didn't know their favorite color. I couldn't tell you anything really of substance about their backgrounds, because prison is an environment that everything is really just based on brute force. And if it comes down to battle, are you going to have my back, and will you go all the way to the wall for me the same way I will for you? Well, we kind of changed that and was like, look, let's have our families on the outside, have a potluck, have a dinner, and get to know each other. And that took a lot, because you don't share your family, you don't share your outside contacts with even your closest comrades in prison, because in the end, it's, you know, there's not a lot of trust there, and that's something that could hurt you. So you're very reluctant to give that up. But we did that, and it was the best thing we did, because it further solidified us. Because when our families found resonance and found unity, they weren't alone. Before, they felt as though they were alone, but now they felt like they had power. And then we spread this concept to other prisons. And this was in the early 2000s, and you got to understand, about that time in Pennsylvania, like, there was no outside prison movement. It was decimated by the crime bill, by mass incarceration. Like, people had just lost hope. But also, too, I think that there was like fertile ground, because we wanted to really establish an adversarial relationship with the prison system. And a lot of the groups that were out there were kind of more like, we're going to play the neutral referee. And we was just like, look, you know, we're tired of telling you about the abuse that's going on in these prisons, and you saying, okay, let me go and get the other side story. Like, there's no two sides here. And that's where we were at. Like, we're done with that. If we telling you that we were all stripped naked in a cell for a week and denied food, there ain't no other side to that. You know what I'm saying? There ain't no other side. You know, regardless of what went down on the tier, you know, there's no other side. And so one thing that we knew, that our families weren't interested in the other side story. So we placed them as leaders. We started our own nonprofits. And we also allied ourselves with more radical activists on the outside, but also community activists, right? Because all of our families weren't necessarily radical, but they wanted to see their loved one free. And that is what we really homed in on, is what is your self-interest? You want your loved one home, and when your loved one is in prison, you want them safe. So for years, we was organizing around those concepts. And I would say that we really built up a formidable movement all across the state of Pennsylvania. Another turning point was in 2017, when we made the decision to directly get involved in politics. You know, for many of us, for even myself included, I'm not here to buttress the, you know, colonial project called the United States of America. But at the same time, I do know that we have to contest within it. And we made the decision that we were going to get involved in electoral politics when DA Larry Krasner ran for office in 2017. And that purely was a self-interest. That was an office that tried to kill me when I was 16 years old. This was someone that said that they weren't going to pursue the death sentence. And by the way, they were going to sue the state to end the death sentence. This was someone that said that they didn't support life without parole sentences. This was someone that had a history of defending Black Lives Matter activists from police brutality. This is someone that had a history of suing the police. This was someone that had a civil rights background. So for us, it was really an easy decision to back DA Krasner, because we're subjected to the harm that system imposed on us firsthand in our communities. And that resulted in him winning. Like, we definitely carried the day. It was really odd, because, man, there were groups of men on prison yards across the state saying, yo, send this information out to your family to vote for DA Larry Krasner for district attorney. And you can imagine, like, it took some political education, but what I will say is everyone understood that self-interest and everyone was harmed by that office. And to understand that office, you got to understand that is the office that had the deadliest DA in Lynn Abraham. That's what she was called, the deadliest DA in America. She sent more people to death row than Texas, Harris, Texas, right? She's Pennsylvania, Philadelphia sent more people to life without parole than any other city in the country. This is the DA that was trying to execute Mumia Abu-Jamal. This was the DA that was sending letters to the parole board to deny the parole for the Move 9, right? Political activists who were framed and set up by the Philadelphia police for a murder in 1979. She was sending letters saying that they should not make parole. They should max their 80-year sentence out. So for us and for other people, like, it was really a no-brainer, but winning that election opened the door for many of us to be released, because the state, when I came up for resentencing, initially wanted to sentence me to 35 years to life. So they wanted me to do an extra 8 years in prison. When Krasner came in, he basically said, look, I'm going to give these guys time served. You know, they've been in prison long enough. They were children. He also set up a conviction integrity unit that has exonerated more people than I think it has like the second most exonerations in the country right now. As an abolitionist, I'm not sitting here. I don't believe in the concept of a progressive prosecutor. I don't believe in that. But what I do believe in is you can have some harm reduction in a prosecutor's office by putting someone in there that listens to movements, right? So that was a really pivotal moment. It resulted in my freedom. It resulted in hundreds of other freedoms, but it also allowed us to realize that as a bloc, we could influence elections. So we were able to influence a lot of elections in Pennsylvania. But more importantly, too, for me, as someone who was in those cages and saw that our folks were pretty much being slaughtered, the contest was a one-sided contest. Now to be in a position where we are actually contesting and fighting back on the political terrain, and we have built up enough movement support and political support that, look, you know, I'm not going to sit here and say we could win, but we can disrupt, we can impede, we can cause enough problems that you're going to have to come and sit down with us. And at least then we could peel off concessions, right? And that's really important for us, because I understand and appreciate the all or nothing approach. But when you're dealing with people who are serving life without parole, death by incarceration sentences, people who've been in solitary confinements for decades, we also understand that, you know, it's like that Yoruba saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So we take that approach when it comes to liberating our folks from prison, while also making sure that we don't get caught up on the reform treadmill, right? So it's definitely a delicate balance. We got burned a few times, we won a few times, but again, the difference is, as someone who fought, someone who boxed, you want to be in the contest. You want to be able to strike back. You want to be able to give the other side a run. And that's what we're doing in Pennsylvania. And, you know, Pennsylvania is a ground zero right now for a lot of fascist politics. You know, Pennsylvania has some of the highest hate rates of hate groups in the state. Those hate groups have found shelter and refuge and embrace in a Republican Party, right? So we're dealing with outright fascists now who are winning elections, who are looking for ways to steal our rights, ethnically cleanse our neighborhoods, gentrify our communities. So those are some of the conditions in Pennsylvania. And then we're also fighting to free Mumia Abu-Jamal. We're fighting to free Fred Muhammad Burton. I think David said it best when Siko Odingo came home. In any other country in the world, man, political prisoners do time come out and are professors at universities. You know, some of them have been elected presidents of countries, but in the United States, they're buried, you know, and if they're Black or if they're brown, then they are buried more. You're not going to hear about them. You're not going to see them. They are literally disappeared. So freeing Mumia Abu-Jamal is a priority, especially with his health. Freeing Fred Muhammad Burton, another prisoner, Joseph Jojo Bowens, another political prisoner. These guys were political prisoners from the 1960s and 1970s, members of the Black Panther Party, Black Liberation Army, who have been in prison over 50 years and have done at minimum 30 years in solitary confinement each. So that's some of the work. Oh, yeah. Okay. No, I mean, yeah, there is, and, you know, sometimes it's hard to cover it all and encompass it all. But so on October 8th, we are going to be in front of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. for oral arguments in the Derek Lee case, which we are asking the court to abolish felony murder in Pennsylvania. And the felony murder, for many folks who may be aware or may not be aware, is where someone, if you were involved in a robbery and someone was killed and you had no knowledge that the person was killed and you weren't the person that did the killing, then you should be eligible for parole. In Pennsylvania is only 2 states in this country where if you're in a situation like that, you will be sentenced to life without parole. So Pennsylvania is ground zero when it comes to death by incarceration sentence. And more importantly, one of the things that has really resonated with our community work is that Pennsylvania has, probably the second highest rate of people serving life without parole in the country, but none of these sentences made our community safer. And that's our point. Like mass incarceration, this project of mass incarceration, extreme sentencing, it has done nothing to make our community safer. If mass incarceration made communities safer, the United States would be the safest country in the world. Like literally, it's that simple. If it came to prisons, policing, and mass incarceration, we would be like Singapore, where you could just leave stuff right out on the street and no one would touch it. But it doesn't, because mass incarceration is not used to make communities safer. It's really used just to contain oppressed communities and also just buttress a police state that, had it not been for that, it would be a free-for-all, because people know that this system is not working for them. So that's part of the political education that we talk about.
It's a privilege to be in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania and work with the community that's risen up from the inside out. It's just made it possible to actually do it. But we have to also be aware that, like, Larry Krasner is a big L liberal. And so a number of months ago, I saw the decertifications. I saw 15, 16, and 17-year-olds starting to get sentenced to decades in prison and being railroaded that way. And the DA's office backed off. They have on their website to this day that they will not prosecute children as adults. And they're in that courtroom 507, doing it every single day. And so Prison Radio has kind of stepped up. And when I started talking, because I knew that it was Saleem that they were doing it to, like I know Saleem, I work with Saleem, but I know it's the next Saleem. It's the child that I want to have to pivot that has the opportunity. So we're in there, but the Abolitionist Law Center stepped up and did court watch trainings and is now organizing people in 507 to actually prevent that from happening. And so it's a real movement that is alive.
And I think that's why I made the clarification that I don't embrace the progressive prosecutor concept, right? That is something that we are going to have to hold Krasner accountable for. And that is, that's part of this dance. In Latin America, they got a term for this. In the 2000s, a lot of the left down there at one time were waging armed struggle decided to get involved in politics, and many of them actually had electoral victories in Bolivia, Venezuela, and they termed the phrase "dancing with dynamite." There's actually a book called it, and it with social movements, social justice movements that are dealing with whether it's liberals or the electoral system, you have to look at it as a dance with dynamite, because you can't get burned. You have to really know what you're doing. And so, yeah, we definitely supported Krasner, and he runs again. We're probably going to support him just because we saw firsthand the positive aspects of some of his policy changes. And we also know what's awaiting, that the right definitely wants that office back, but we also going to push him like, yo, you got to cut that shit out. So that's going to be part of the court watching. What we want to do again is get the data so that when we approach him, you can't say, oh, well, it's not happening, or let me check it out. It's like, no, actually, here's the data. Here's the court watchers. You have to roll this policy back. So again, that's the give and take. That's the push and pull of just movement politics. Hey, look, I don't really have to tell you guys it because you saw it firsthand out here with Chaser, with David Gilbert's son, right? Victories won in America, you could only hold them as long as you could keep them, because they're coming right back the next cycle. Sometimes they're coming back the right next day to take it back. So for us, again, it's all push and take with any politician that we endorse and embrace, unless there's someone that has come out of our movement. And we have a couple of those who won, and those are what we call movement partners that, we know that if we go to them and ask them for something, it's going to be done.
So we can take a few questions if people want to have questions, I can tell people about Mumia Abu-Jamal's current case, current state. But we'll hear from you.
Where was? Sorry.
Does anybody have a question?
Do tell us about Mumia.
So Mumia Abu-Jamal has done 42 years in prison, and he has had many health crises in the last 10 or so. The Abolitionist Law Center are his criminal defense attorneys, along with Sam Spital from the Legal Defense Fund, which was the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and Judith Ritter, a local attorney. I work on his medical team in terms of I'm a lawyer, private investigator, and we've done the cases that have successfully gotten him care for hepatitis C. That was 2 years after he was diagnosed. So he had the cure, but he has extra hepatic conditions and things that he suffered from that delay. And when the Abolitionist Law Center took the case, they established the first preliminary injunction in the country for prisoners to get the cure. And so that was used by other prisoners around the country, and it was one of their first 4 cases. So that is the way in which we work together to get people care inside. Mumia Abu-Jamal in 2021 had a cardiac condition and had double bypass surgery. And we have been working very closely with researchers at the Abolitionist Law Center and others to get a cardiac diet. And that's been a very long process. The prison process of getting improvements in conditions is laborious and tough, but we have seen change. Every postcard people sent, every call they made, there is more wheat bread, there are more vegetables, there are more, they made changes. Now that's tough because they moved the goalposts. It's not enough. They are still denying him adequate calories. They deny people adequate calories because they want to make money on the commissary. So like the prison industrial complex is really a commodification of these people. Saleem was the lead plaintiff in a case where they took Saleem's vote when he went to prison. And now that he's out, that county that he was imprisoned in has kept his vote. And they've done that for many, many types of felonies or prisoners. So they are taking people's votes and exporting them to the rural counties where the prisons are. So these are kinds of gerrymandering things that Saleem and the ALC and other people are working on, but we are continuing to do that work. Mumia was great this week. Like his health goes way up and way down. We have to have our eyes on him. I have to see him. I'm now seeing him a lot, 3 or 4 times a month, but I go at least twice a month because his health is precarious. He has a number of conditions that make it, if he has recently fallen out while he's been reading. But last week he was doing great and he is getting more exercise. The prison isn't, every single thing about prison seems to be very crazy. He's able to get exercise because he saved a plug from Huntingdon 25 years ago. So he can plug in the elliptical machine, but nobody else on the unit can, except for the Puerto Rican guy who's wired a 6-volt battery to do it. So the prison is terrible. We want him out of there. Mahanoy is I think a very draconian place, a restricted place, and we would like to see him transferred, but he's in the middle of his PhD. So it's very difficult for Mumia to move, for us to advocate for him to move, because he's finishing his PhD and he's all his books. So I've tried to talk to him recently about once he has his whole PhD done and he has all of the notes and he knows what books are that he's citing, that then he will move. And then he will advocate for himself to move out of this prison that's super restrictive. He's in his cell at least 16 hours a day. He has 4 feet square to work with. He cannot move. It's 18 inches side to side and it's 7 feet that way. And he's got a lot of books. So he does not get enough exercise. And cardiac care is all about exercise and diet.
Anybody else?
Excuse me. I don't speak a very good English, so I might be confusing and I might be confused. So, you talked about being an abolitionist, right? And I was wondering what exactly that meant. Do you mean you completely want all the type of incarceration to be revoked? Is it just in the United States? Is it worldwide? Is it just I've come to understand that in America prisons were mostly private. Do you want to make them public? I'm not sure what does that exactly mean, and how will that apply concretely?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I think that's a really great question. First, most prisons in the United States aren't private. That's a misconception. Less than 7% of the prisoners in the United States are actually in private prisons. So that shows you the number. 7%, only 7% of prisoners in the United States are in private prisons. So when it comes to abolition, I'll tell you, initially when I first talking about abolition, we used to talk in terms of abolishing police and prisons as if they were some type of anomaly within the United States society. And that is, if you got rid of police and prisons, everything else is okay. And that's not the case. Police, and particularly prisons, are kind of like, I call it like the drain, where all of society's ills or everything in this country that is wrong, everything pours down to, right? So the reason why communities that have the most poor people in them have the most people in prison, it's related to the social contract. So for me, abolition isn't about abolishing police and prisons. It's about abolishing the social contract that has governed the United States. It's about abolishing capitalism, right? And in terms of police and prisons, you got to understand that prisons is a concept that really came out of Western Europe 500 years ago. Indigenous cultures and societies really have had no definition or word for prisons. Now, that doesn't mean, I'm not going to sit here and say it like it was the best of situation if you violated a community norm, but the idea of taking human beings wholesale and putting them in cages, that is something that society has only been doing for 500 years, right? So for me, certainly we're going to have to come up with some different ways of regulating people, or for people who break laws or community laws. But I don't believe prisons are the solution to that. And I don't believe prisons are, because like I said, my community has the most policing it, and in my community is not safe. This country has the most people incarcerated in the world, and it's not a safe country. So we need to do something differently. And how we do that, I will be straight, I don't have all the answers to that, but I do know that it starts with abolishing this system that creates those conditions where entire generations and people are trapped in poverty, and to abolish a system where basically 2% of the people 2% control 98% of the wealth. If you want to look at why we have these problems in this country, that's the problem right there. So we definitely, as abolitionists, look beyond, particularly me, because of our political education, look beyond just police and prisons when it comes to abolition. We're actually seeking to abolish all of this that has basically created these conditions where we have close to 2 million people in prison. So that's where it starts. And certainly being an abolitionist, this is very important. I believe in accountability. Like, if you harm me, you're going to be held accountable. If you're in my community, if there are people who are doing nonsense, they are going to be held accountable. Just not going to call the police, right? Because I don't believe that they are going to make it safe. And it's not even a thing that I don't believe. We know that they're not going to make it safer, because we see them round people up every day in our communities and nothing changes. So real abolitionists understand that you have to have accountability if people are causing harm, right? And we have to develop ways. Now, there's ways like restorative justice. Those are ways in Philadelphia. There are people who commit lower level offenses, have diversion programs where they can meet with the community member they harmed. They could have a conversation about how they harmed that person. They could talk about what type of restitution they can do, right, to replace either the property that was stolen. When I was in prison, we had conversations where people who had killed each other's homies or loved ones actually had to sit down and figure out, because we had to live together and had to figure out, listen, how are we going to resolve this? Like, once we leave out this cell, are we going to exist peacefully within this prison, or are we going to go back to ourselves and arm up and just handle this in the yard? And a lot of times during those sit downs, you would have someone looking across from someone who killed one of their best friends. And we would have a very drawn out conversation about what happened, why it happened, why don't our neighborhoods get along, what was the beef, who started this beef, how did this shit happen? I can't sit here and tell you that every time we left out of that cell and it was cool, but most of the times we were able to resolve it without the state. And I do believe that that's possible. And there are neighborhoods, and actually I'll be honest with you, every night in cities across this country, neighborhoods are resolving their problems without the state. It's called retribution. You know, in Philadelphia, if someone get killed, another neighborhood quickly retaliates for that, right? So there's already people doing this, and I'm not saying that that is what we're aspiring to. I'm giving you an example that people are already gotten to the point where they don't believe that the state can resolve this, so they're taking it upon themselves. The youth are taking it upon themselves. So what we're trying to do is do restorative justice programs, transformative justice programs. People that did time are going into those communities, talking to those young guys causing harm, talking to those family members who have lost loved ones to violence, getting them together to talk. So it's a long, drawn out process. I'm not under any illusion that I can solve this, or many people even in this room can solve it. It's going to have to be a changing of the state that can solve it, where we don't have communities vying and killing each other over meager drug profits.
Okay, we've got another question back here. If you can keep this really close.
So I want to just add to Saleem's great answer about what it means, abolition. But I think for most abolitionists, part and parcel of the destruction of the prison industrial complex is a redirection of the enormous resources that are currently invested in this destructive system, and a redirection of those resources back into those communities, right? So for every dollar you spend in a prison, it's a dollar you're not spending on childcare or schools or foods or job programs, and that it's a theft, it's a system of theft out of community resources from the most impacted communities. So that's why some abolitionists didn't love defund the police as a favorite slogan, because it was like a tax savings approach, and that's not the idea of abolition, that we're going to somehow save taxes by not having prisons, but rather that we would use those resources to invest in communities, and that would actually resolve a lot of the issues that bring people into prisons.
We've been here for a while, and I just want to thank everybody and know that supporting prison radio is really important, airing the voices of prisoners, putting together books like this, working in coalition in Pennsylvania. So please go to Prison Radio's website, please buy the book here, and also please support groups like the Abolitionist Law Center.
In addition to buying Beneath the Mountain, over there you'll see a book called I Am Maroon. That is another one of my mentors. So please buy that book too if you can. Yes, he's in there too. Russell Maroon Schultz is in that book, but his autobiography that just came out is over there called I Am Maroon. So please get both of these books if you can.
And Mumia's freedom is possible. Russell Maroon Schultz was freed. And when you read his story, when you get his book, you'll know that it's possible that we can bring home everyone, including David Gilbert, including Saleem, including Mumia Abu-Jamal.
Yeah, I just want to say that it would be great to have Jennifer and Saleem up here to sign books. So David, and have more conversations and find out more about David's story, which I was curious about as well. And Noelle is here too. So you can purchase the book at the register and then come back, and please get it signed by Jennifer and Saleem. Thanks so much for coming.